Hello! Today I'm taking a brief departure from my usual game discourses to entertain a bit of subjective opinion, and as the channel inches towards 5k subscribers, something that celebrates with a multiple of 5. Now, I don't usually indulge top 10 or top 5 type conversations, mostly because my own opinions shift quite a lot, and I rarely maintain a rigid hierarchy of favourite anything. But I think with the subject of Final Fantasy, particularly Final Fantasy villains, it's a nice conversation to have because there have been so many wild and unique entries over the years. Considering which of these villains stand out to us and why is quite an interesting way to look at the games, particularly as game stories can often make or break based on the quality of an obstacle or an antagonist, I think. So, for my part, I will qualify my opinion for my chosen 5 during this episode, which are in no particular order. And I'm sure others have their own particular ideas of who should rank and why, and I'd be interested to hear those too. So, kicking off, I'll jump right in with Kefka, because he is rightly, I think, an often discussed and well-regarded villain in the Final Fantasy universe, which has in turn actually left some players, and particularly newer Final Fantasy players, to question why. And I think this boils down as much to historical context as it does to personal preference. Now, I think a lot of Kefka's appeal resides in what he brought to the series at the time and place Final Fantasy VI was released, because up to this point we'd had somewhat obscure antagonists, some of which wouldn't be revealed until right at the end of the game, or the final battle. And Kefka was, by contrast, an immediately distinct personality who was introduced early on and propelled the action and urgency of Final Fantasy VI forwards. Indeed, it's not an understatement to suggest that the tone of Final Fantasy VI, which is very fraught with tension from the outset, is largely down to Kefka's inclusion and his relentlessness in conquesting and murdering his way towards the returners. And as such, the game maintains, a consistently tense pace that isn't seen in many of the other Final Fantasy games, I think. Looking at Kefka today, I think his uniqueness stands out with age because we can see through the passage of time and having played subsequent Final Fantasy games that his design, his personality, and the fact that he is largely successful in his end goals set him apart from what has come before or since. On the first point, the bizarre Harlequin attire separates Kefka from other villains, who are often severe-looking, obtuse, mage or warrior type characters. And instead of this, we're offered a brightly clad individual with a very distinctive laugh, an apparent lack of severity about him. And the reason this works, I think, is because of how radically it juxtaposes with his inherently evil actions and intent. This holds true for his personality as well, and we often find Kefka cracking jokes or making sarcastic observations while he's doing unforgivable things like poisoning the population at Doma. And his theme, his theme music, not his boss music, it's likewise this sort of pantomime music which distracts from the magnitude of his villainous intentions, particularly early on when we see Kefka only as a rogue general, acting on behalf of Emperor Gustal, the latter of which is an excellent red herring antagonist, right up to the moment that Kefka murders him, and plunges the game into an unexpected direction as we emerge into a world of ruin. So Kefka is a great bad guy, and while there is a hint of reasoning behind why he is the way he is, which is the fact he's a product of experimentation gone wrong, I like that they didn't dwell too heavily on this and make it a kind of sympathetic or human story, because Kefka endures precisely because he lacks any residue of humanity or morality, and he imposes himself on the story as a force of nature, intent on destruction, more than anything else. The next villain I'd like to discuss is Vayne Solidor from Final Fantasy XII, and I'm not sure I've ever seen Vayne rank among best Final Fantasy villains, perhaps because he's a very subdued and political antagonist compared to the more ostentatious warriors and sorcerers that comprise the rest of Final Fantasy's rogue gallery. But personally, I think he makes for an excellent foil to 12's story, and he is exemplary of the Ivalice games, which are more given to political and ideological struggles and conflicted ensembles of human characters, fighting amongst themselves, rather than any necessarily kind of external forces or, demonic creatures. And on this note, Delita from Final Fantasy Tactics is among my favourite characters ever to appear in a Final Fantasy game, owing to his moral complexity and his political greyness. And it's only because I struggle to call him a villain that I omit him from this list. And just as an aside, I think it's in some ways a shame that Final Fantasy Tactics exists as such a niche style of CRPG, because it has one of the best stories and character ensembles, I think, and yet comparatively less people have experienced it. But back to Vayne, I think that much like Delita from Tactics, his appeal resides in his interpretable agenda throughout the game story. And to this day, fans of 12 remain divided on whether Vayne's actions were out of some pursuit of the greater good, or for some megalomaniacal pursuit of total power. And I love that the game can create such an enduring discussion over its antagonist, and how, rather than relying on magic or brute strength, Vayne's attributes as a villain are very much human ones. He is a skilled strategist, statesman, very politically Machiavellian, and rather than the stories focus on Vayne showing him doing heinous things, such as the aforementioned Kefka poisoning water supplies, much of his manoeuvring comes through manipulative dialogues and sleight-of-hand discussions, which is a step change for a mainline Final Fantasy. But of course, it wasn't to everyone's tastes, and I do appreciate that Final Fantasy XII didn't go down well with a lot of fans. So I discussed in my Final Fantasy XII episode how Vayne and the imperial framework of 12 is very reminiscent of the Roman Empire, and how there's many overlapping and conflicting elements at work within it, where we have the judges, who are analogues to the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, who are supposed to represent the people, and the Emperor, who kind of holds power and is, the figurehead of state. And it's interesting to observe how Vayne operates within this, setting one against the other and manipulating, if not murdering, his way to the top. And his actions, such as, dissolving the Senate, which he perceives as corrupt, is reminiscent of Roman generals, such as Sulla, who took control of Rome by force, to root out corruption and restore order before he handed it back to the people. But on the other hand, it also resembles the less selfless symbols of Rome, such as Julius Caesar, who likewise took control of the state, but never handed control back again. And I discussed this at length in the 12 episode, but suffice to say, Vayne straddles these two perceptions, and whether he begins with pure intentions about salvaging humanity from their helpless, predetermined fate at the hands of the Okuria gods, and is tragically corrupted along his path, or whether his pursuit is simply one for total power, and his supposedly noble pursuit is just posturing for the public, it's still up for debate. And like all great antagonists, how we choose to perceive them impacts how we perceive the entire story. Because if we suppose that Vayne's intentions are for the greater good, then Ash and the Central Party's pursuits are by contrast, in the service of the bad, because the Okuria have chosen Ash as the Dynast King. So it's very interesting, this dynamic, and particularly if you're more into the slow burn political dramas, this is the sort of game that Ivalice games and Vayne's story in particular, are very much appealing to that sort of player. Moving on to the next villain, I'd like to discuss Seymour from Final Fantasy X. And this is a game that I've been playing through recently, and it's also a game with which my opinions have most drastically changed over time. And it's gone from a title I sort of enjoyed, but didn't like as much as the earlier games, to one that actually now ranks within my top 5, if not my top 3 Final Fantasy games today. But as I say, my opinions shift quite a lot. But Seymour as a component of that has risen in my estimations from what I'd previously assumed was a run-of-the-mill maniacal bad guy, to one with much more nuance when we come to consider his story. And the genius of this, and the genius of much of Final Fantasy X's world building, is that certain aspects of characters aren't outrightly explained or presented to the player, but rather they are delivered through subtle allusions and hints at the past that often come through optional dialogues and side quests or spheres which we can discover throughout the world. Regarding Seymour specifically, it is perhaps the optional quest to obtain anima that is the most revealing, and how the loss of his mother and his subsequent isolation from the world, a world which, for the record, despised him as a sacrilegious half-breed between Guado and human, contributed to what would become an intensely twisted worldview wherein he believes destruction is the only means of salvation. This, compounded with the ambiguity of his relationship with his father, Lord Jyscal, which we can only really theorise upon as it resulted in Jyscal's murder, and there's a lot of opinions about that, and whether Seymour's conception was a political manoeuvre rather than one of romance, and how much his father cared about him. But all of this layeredness and room for interpretation makes his character a very interesting sort of villainy, which, if not necessarily sympathetic, then certainly tragic, and I will return to discuss Final Fantasy X at length another time. But the father-child and particularly the father-son dynamic is a very notable theme or framework in this game with some of the central characters. And this is something that's quite unique to Final Fantasy X and is really interesting when we look at characters like Seymour, but of course Tidus and Yuna as well. So I think a lot of this ambiguity and context makes Seymour a lot more interesting than what initially meets the eye, particularly when we consider his rather wacky design, which emphasises aspects of both Guado and human appearance. And on that note, I think, again, at face value, he's brilliantly written, and what I used to think was a bit obvious in terms of his disposition and dialogue, and also his theme music, which is immediately sinister, and I used to think, well, it's a bit obvious, it's not very well written because he's obviously bad. But in retrospect, I think this emphasises how brazen and narcissistic his brand of villainy actually is. For example, I think one of the standout exchanges with Seymour early in the game is just prior to Operation Mi'ihen, where Wakka points out that Yevon shouldn't be endorsing the use of Machina technology. And Seymour shrugs this off and says, well, pretend you never saw it. And everyone's kind of shocked that he'd actually say this. Now, when I first played through the game, I thought this was a bit on the nose and was much too obvious about how it positioned Seymour as a bad person. But really what this does is it shows how much Seymour just doesn't care that he's a bad guy. He's so self-assured that he's basically saying to us, here I am, I'm a bad guy. What can you do about it? And looking more broadly at Seymour's station in life and his position, unlike most other Final Fantasy villains, he's actually a celebrated public figure. He's a high-ranking priest in the Church of Yevon. And for all intents and purposes, he's an avatar of hope and salvation and positivity for the world of Spira. And so it's wonderful how the public's perception of him is so juxtaposed with the reality. And what's particular to his villainy is that we discover he's an awful person pretty much immediately, and yet the institutional corruption of Yevon, which enables Seymour's behaviour, and the near universal adoration, of the Maesters by the denizens of Spira, means that the odds are completely stacked against us. They're stacked against Yuna's party with how to depose him. And to that end, I think the recurring dialogues with Shalinda, the Yevon acolyte we encounter, they are great insights into the public mood and the almost desperate hope with which they cling to these ideas and the institution of Yevon. The fourth penultimate villain I'd like to discuss is Ardyn Izunia from Final Fantasy XV. Now, the Final Fantasy XV story isn't often regarded as the best of the bunch, owing to its beleaguered production and the range of media and DLC that the full story was actually released across, which some felt it was a bit patchworky. But for me personally, I think Ardyn is a very strong inclusion, and I think he carries the story of the central game in several places. And personally, in a lot of sections of the game, I was encouraged to progress, more so because I wanted to find out about this mysterious guy who sporadically appeared, more so than necessarily collecting the astrals or seeing if Noctis reunites with Luna and so on. And the way Ardyn's inclusion was structured and incrementally paced alongside other elements of the story was great, because it brilliantly built towards what would become a dramatic reveal and the rather cataclysmic events of the endgame. Indeed, I would go so far as to suggest that Ardyn's character works precisely because he incorporates several of the appealing traits from the aforementioned villains. For example, like Vayne, he's a very adept, silver-tongued politician who, while he doesn't quite inspire trust, he does just enough in each interaction to give the benefit of the doubt, manipulating everyone from Ravus to Noctis to the Emperor, which is brilliant characterization, I think. Like Seymour, once we scratch below the surface and take into account Ardyn's origin story, our entire perception of the character changes. And as mentioned, if it doesn't quite inspire sympathy, because they are so far gone, down this road to ruin. But with Ardyn, I would say, for a lot of people, it did inspire a more sympathetic approach to his character. Then we can certainly acknowledge that it is at least a tragic story. And finally, like Kefka, Ardyn has an immediate aesthetic flamboyance and demeanour, with Noctis even calling him a jester in their final altercation, where he says, "Get off my throne, jester," or something like that. But more importantly, with this similarity to Kefka, Ardyn succeeds in his aims, and we might argue that unlike most other Final Fantasy villains, he actually entirely succeeds in his aims, because not only does the player end up in a realm of ruin, which Ardyn has brought about, but Ardyn succeeds in ending the Lucian dynasty, which was one of his primary goals, and he's also manipulated Noctis into this inevitable showdown and endgame to which Ardyn's own tortured life is brought to an end, which, again, is something that he'd been desperately seeking. So he's a very interesting guy, and breaking him down, it's interesting to see how he goes from this low-key, slightly jokey, devious raconteur sort of character who indulges us in little car chases and riddling prose that seem of no purpose or consequence, really. And he goes from that to become this monster who murders Luna Freya before our very eyes. And he plays increasing mind games, such as the train segment where we're pursuing him through the carriages, and also the infamous Chapter 13, Xegnortus Keep. And finally, he reveals his true face, which is that of a demonified monster. And all of this has been his well-orchestrated effort to groom and manipulate Noctis towards an act of revenge that would finally end Ardyn's life. So it's very interesting, and I think his character was very well developed, particularly accounting for his backstory, where we find that he's been unfairly ousted from his birthright by the gods. And for their part, for the first time in a Final Fantasy game, we see these summonable beings, and particularly Bahamut, as quite morally dubious creatures. And I think it just adds another layer to Ardyn. And even though I liked him, just as a standalone bad guy, I think the fact he's been given such a raw deal and inspired such sympathy from us as an audience, it gives a great third dimension to him where we kind of understand where he's coming from. So moving on to the fifth and final Final Fantasy antagonist, I think is worth discussing. And as you've probably guessed, it is, of course, Necron from Final Fantasy IX. Now, no, obviously I'm joking. It's Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. And Sephiroth, much like Kefka before him, has persisted in the ranks of favourite Final Fantasy villains, not just within the Final Fantasy kind of fandom, but also within games media discourses in general. And for years, he's kind of tended to rank in top tens when we look at the history of video game antagonists and stuff like that. Which, again, like Kefka, has naturally led to some revisionist criticism, questioning whether Sephiroth is actually that good and does he warrant such high regard. And in my opinion, the short answer to that is yes, because historically, the way he was written and characterized at the time brought a lot to the table within the realms of JRPGs, and it was almost unprecedented, the quality of the story as a whole, but also Sephiroth's inclusion in that. And not only that, and the historical context of Sephiroth and the innovations of Final Fantasy VII, But it's prudent to note that it has longevity too. It wasn't just the case that Sephiroth was well written for the time and for the limitations of game storytelling in the 90s, but actually his inclusion in Final Fantasy VII, the way he was written, the way it was paced, and the way he was interwoven with the central story and the plight of Cloud is as poignant today as any other game antagonist I can think of. And while subsequent appearances, such as Kingdom Hearts, but particularly the more canonical ones, such as Advent Children and the Final Fantasy VII Remake, while these have left some fans rather nervous about whether they are just bastardizing and capitalizing on Sephiroth's popularity, at the expense of his inherent mystique, I personally don't see any of that as concerning. I don't think it detracts from his original appearance and the excellent narrative build throughout Final Fantasy VII. And, just taking Advent Children, for example, I actually don't mind that film. I thought it was fine. It's entertaining. But I also tend to forget that it exists as well, unless someone reminds me of it. So I think regarding this kind of concern around Sephiroth's legacy, I think fans will tend to remember the media and the characterizations that really profoundly affected them and stands out to them. It's entirely subjective, and I don't think it's necessarily a concern. So, looking back to Final Fantasy VII, I think the immediate quality to Sephiroth, which actually kind of counters how they approached him in the remake, was the elusiveness and the gradual pace in which he is introduced to the audience. And indeed, rather than first meeting him face to face early on, as we do with most, if not all, of the aforementioned antagonists I've discussed here, Sephiroth is built in the minds of the audience by discussion and allusion and passing references for the first several hours of Final Fantasy VII's story. For example, Cloud's flashback to the promise made by the well, where he tells Tifa he'll become strong like Sephiroth one day, is exactly the sort of hint that plants the seed of this character, and it plants the idea that this Sephiroth person is obviously of repute. And this is followed by our first tangible hint of Sephiroth's devastating strength and disposition, where we follow the blood-stained halls of Shinra HQ to find President Shinra, murdered by the Masamune sword in his office. And later, of course, we see the Midgar very unceremoniously impaled on a tree once we cross over the world map of Midgar. So all of these little bits kind of contribute and build an image of the man Sephiroth has now become. And it has a hint of menace and intrigue about it, which I think endures as some of the best characterization and pacing that I've seen in a narrative-driven game title. And indeed, we spend the majority of the first disc kind of interacting with NPCs who say that they've just seen a man pass through in a black cape. And all of this contributes to the intriguing pursuit of Sephiroth, who is always one step ahead. Now, as I've discussed with Ardyn, the backstory for Sephiroth, which in Final Fantasy VII is helpfully featured in the main game, helps us build an idea of him that is contrary to the antagonistic villain he appears to have become. And the exchanges that take place during the Nibelheim flashbacks are brilliant at establishing Sephiroth as a stoic, but not necessarily unsympathetic character, who becomes irrevocably unhinged when he learns the truth about his birth. And this character arc of Sephiroth and his dubious beginnings also brilliantly encapsulates the themes, setting, and dystopian mood of Final Fantasy VII. And as the product of scientific experiments by the amoral, or definitely immoral actually, Professor Hojo, which is funded by the evil Shinra company, and created from the genetic material of a malignant extraterrestrial alien, Genova, not only do all the antagonistic elements of Final Fantasy VII's world combine to result in Sephiroth, and they've contributed to him. But more broadly, the dramatic shift Final Fantasy VII took towards futurism and sci-fi, rather than conventional high fantasy, is embodied in Sephiroth's inclusion too. So in many ways, he is more than simply a well-written villain, but so too is he an avatar for the step change of the series that was taken with this milestone PlayStation 1 installment. Finally, Sephiroth is something of an aesthetic anomaly among Final Fantasy villains, and where the aforementioned characters, barring perhaps Vayne, had a certain flourish about them, whether it's Kefka's attire or Ardyn's scarves in his hat or Seymour's wild hair, the more reductive design and simple black attire is a great example of less is more, I think, and the only distinguishing features of Sephiroth being his shoulder pauldrons and the Masamune sword make him stand out as a very adept utilitarian warrior figure, rather than someone concerned with appearances or accessories or any sort of aesthetic flourish. And as I mentioned in my Cloud episode, the same goes for Cloud 2, I think. And I think the duality between these two, from design right through to personality, that threads so much of Final Fantasy VII together, is an excellent work of narrative design. And while many antagonists share some sort of fated connection with a hero, particularly in Final Fantasy, I think the one shared between Sephiroth and Cloud and the whole manipulative memory crisis and identity theme plays out incredibly well between them. Because in many ways, Cloud is his own central foil. He's his own worst enemy. And Sephiroth kind of services that and encourages that, but he doesn't necessarily conflict with it or get in the way or dilute it either, because he's utilised so sparingly that every appearance he makes in the game, it has a certain weight to it and a certain gravitas and intrigue. So yeah, I think everything from the pacing to the aesthetics makes Sephiroth stand out for me as a great villain. And while his subsequent appearances have been questioned, I think his reputation is rightly maintained by his role in the original story. So that about wraps up the Top 5 Villains episode. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like this style of episode, I could certainly look to do a few more on perhaps some other subject matter. So finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, you can do so by subscribing, if you haven't already, and checking out some of the links in the description. And let me know your thoughts. What are your top 5 Final Fantasy villains?